Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. Last week, we met Captain William Pierce, a largely forgotten man from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He'd been one of the earliest seamen to frequent the New England area from the time of the Pilgrims' landing at Plymouth. He'd made a desperate sprint across the Atlantic at John Winthrop's request the first winter of Massachusetts Bay's founding. It could be argued that he saved them from starvation. Some would argue that the celebration upon his return was actually the first Thanksgiving. He was a close friend of Edward Winslow and William Bradford of Plymouth, as well as John Winthrop of Massachusetts Bay. He was also connected with the Earl of Warwick, Lord Brooke, and Viscount Say and Seal, prominent men in the Puritan movement in England. These were the Puritan leaders who funded Saybrook in Connecticut, as well as Providence Island. And he had an interest in the northern colonies, as well as the Caribbean and West Indies. And for a while, the colonies of that region looked like they may swallow up the future dominance of Massachusetts Bay. Interestingly enough, Captain Pierce played a pivotal role in helping to build that Southern enthusiasm. He also played a pivotal role in diffusing the whole notion. Nevertheless, his ultimate contribution had to do with the development of triangular trade, including the African slave trade. Not just its humble beginnings that we briefly developed last week, but its growth in the New England economy. By the 1640s, both New England and the Caribbean had extensive Puritan colonization efforts underway. There were many men who had an interest in both regions. William Pierce, you remember, had transported Pequots to the Caribbean after the Pequot War. It was in that trip that he not only realized the potential trade opportunities between the regions, but also introduced New England to the African slave trade by bringing some back with him. We'll talk about how that original cargo, human cargo, impacted the New England region probably next week. We don't generally think of New England as playing a big role in American slavery, but they did. Anyway, we'll walk through the various events that led to the institution of American slavery. Did it all start with William Pierce? Was he single-handedly responsible for it? No, of course not. But he did play an instrumental role. He almost played an instrumental role in the stifling of the growing hegemony of Boston, unintentionally, of course. What started out as a possible threat to New England's growth and Boston's influence ended up strengthening the region's position. I think there are a few things to keep in mind when we talk about this aspect of colonial commercial development. First, the weather and climate were more appealing the farther south you went. I mean, not a lot has changed since then, right? And a lot of these guys, English guys, not necessarily uniquely the Puritans, had large-scale farming in mind from the start. That's why both Anglican and Puritan alike were pretty open to creating some form of European feudalism in the New World. It does kind of strike me a little odd. I mean, it had failed in Europe over the last century for a number of reasons. But there were a lot of guys that saw an opportunity to make money with that antiquated system, if it was only done the right way. So they wanted a lot of land, warm climate for long growing seasons, and workers, lots and lots of workers. New England's climate and terrain would never support that kind of system. So by the 1640s, there were a few separate events and people that began to encourage New Englanders, more specifically Bostonians, that there may be greater opportunities to the south. So we've met William Pierce, and we know he's going to play a huge role in our narrative today. But let's meet one more person before we talk about the final voyage of William Pierce. This man was on that voyage. This man instigated it, much to the dismay of John Winthrop and the magistrates. And his name was John Humphrey. He's another guy that was absolutely critical to the survival and growth of New England. John Humphrey was an early leader of the Bay Colony. He was actually supposed to be John Winthrop's deputy governor. Well, he was elected deputy governor and held the position from 1629 to 1630, but he did not actually cross the Atlantic until 1634. Soon after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded, he was replaced by Thomas Dudley. Now, he wasn't derelict in his duties. On the contrary, the settling of Massachusetts Bay had been a long-time ambition for a lot of people. Humphrey had been the treasurer of the Dorchester Company earlier in the decade, and they had tried to establish Massachusetts Bay in the early 1620s, but could not muster the necessary funds. And by 1625, that effort was abandoned. I think we went into a little more detail when we did our episode on the founding of Massachusetts Bay, because there were some other smaller settlements or colonies between 1625 and 1630. But at any rate, once the colony was settled, there was conflict over its future. If you remember in our John Mason series, where we combined a lot of John Mason's story with a little of Fernando Gorges, who has shown up quite a bit throughout the podcast, a little here and a little there. Anyway, Massachusetts Bay eventually became a reality and another controversy emerged. The real power broker for almost all of the eastern seaboard of North America, from Virginia moving north to as far as Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, was Fernando Gorges. He was not a Puritan. He was not a Puritan sympathizer. He was an antagonist. He was an Anglican. He wanted to establish an Anglican stronghold in New England. He and Governor John Mason, not Captain John Mason of the Pequot War, Governor John Mason, a true national hero in England and worthy of further study for history folks, tried to have the charter revoked. It almost worked. In fact, John Mason died en route to Massachusetts Bay from England with the intent of dissolving the colony. Unfortunately for Mason and Gorges, he never arrived. Fortunately for the Massachusetts Bay Puritans, he never arrived. In any event, John Humphreys was one of the men that had stayed behind to challenge Gorges and Mason. So, just because he seems to have all but disappeared from the popular narrative, one could argue a good chunk of our national history would be very different if he had not prolonged the attempts by the Anglicans. Maybe there would have been no rebellion a century and a half later. I mean, certainly the entire political makeup of New England would have developed very differently. After the first attempt to colonize Massachusetts Bay had failed, John Humphrey and his minister, John White, worked a plan. White was in charge of raising the funds for another colony, while Humphrey worked the Puritan faction for supporters. In 1628, the dream became a reality and Massachusetts Bay Company was formed. Like before, Humphrey was an investor and the treasurer of the new company. Now, keep all this in mind, maybe not every detail, but enough of the thought process to recognize how influential John Humphrey was to the leaders in Puritan society. John Winthrop and Thomas Dudley were also drawn into the colonization through Humphrey's connections. In 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was granted a royal charter. And I've got to think this royal charter was at least in part responsible for Ferdinand Gorges' attempts to take over the colony beginning in 1633. I mean, Charles I was on the throne. The throne's goal was profit. And besides, even though he was supposed to be an Anglican, Charles lived a pretty loose and wild life. So I'm sure the desire for an Anglican colony was far more dear to the heart of Gorges than the king himself. So in 1634, John Humphrey finally packed his family up and moved to Massachusetts Bay. And he was immediately plugged into leadership roles. He even sat in judgment at the trial of Anne Hutchinson. And again, we spent a considerable amount of time on the antinomian controversy. Actually, it may have been his involvement in that controversy that soured his opinion of Massachusetts Bay. He would end up siding with Henry Vane, the more moderate Puritan, who was governor at the time. Vane, along with men like Stephen Wheelwright and John Underhill, had sided with Anne Hutchinson, and they all paid a huge price for that. You remember John Wheelwright fled to New Hampshire, which, oddly enough, is where John Mason had been governor, at least in title. I'm not so sure he ever set foot in the colony. John Underhill was banished. Well, he did a few other things to cause his banishment as well, but taking the side of Anne Hutchinson didn't help. But from the colony standpoint, his best military work had been done for the colony, so he was expendable. Governor Vane was not only run out of office, but the colony itself. He went back to England in 1641. We've covered all of this in previous episodes. I just want to, again, bring out this concept of the layers of events that were going on, the rapid fire, the rapid pace with which Massachusetts Bay was being organized, all the constant change, the constant conflict and controversies. So anyway, Humphrey was active during the English Civil War in England and would later try to settle a colony in the Bahamas. That failed, and he ended up dying in 1651. But those in-between years are of interest for our story today, the early 1640s, between the Antinomian controversy and him being involved in the English Civil War. And this is where the paths of William Pierce and John Humphrey intersect for our narrative. As his interest in Massachusetts Bay declined, John Humphrey's attention was drawn to the Caribbean. Remember, he had a lot of connections in England, a lot of Puritan connections. He was in the circle of guys like Lord Saye Seal. And in 1640, he was offered the governorship of Providence Island. He accepted the offer, and from his station in Massachusetts Bay, began to recruit colonists for the Caribbean colony. Obviously, the leaders of Massachusetts Bay were not happy. After all the controversies and endless internal conflicts of the Bay Colony, this must have seemed like a great opportunity. Nicer weather, at this point, more successful, the emerging feudalistic economy. So much like the good old days. Think about the decade the Massachusetts Bay folks had just lived through. We like to think it was all rosy. Oh, sure, maybe a few rough years, but then bam, overwhelming success. But that's not the case. Near starvation, rigid religious doctrine that saw many prominent people's lives destroyed, causing others to live in fear. The Pequot War, the siphoning off of folks to Connecticut and New Haven that represented new competition, not to mention Roger Williams in Rhode Island. Then, an offer to move to an area on the rise, maybe a little more lenient in their religious views, a little more tolerant. Well, he managed to persuade quite a few people that the move might be a good one. By this time, some of that silver from down there was beginning to trickle into the economy up north. Wouldn't it be nice to get some of that? Put away the wampum and trade in recognizable, regulated European coin and currency. A lot of people were willing to move. Fortunately for Massachusetts Bay, there was a shortage of ships at the time, and they were only able to muster 2 for the initial voyage. One, which transported John Humphrey, and the other belonging to Captain William Pierce, the Desire, and it was the summer of 1641. So they set off for Providence Island, and I'm not sure how many people were on John Humphrey's ship, but Pierce had 43 passengers on his. And there was a downside to Providence Island. It was geographically located in the Spanish Caribbean, Catholic Spanish Caribbean. And these were not just Englishmen, they were Protestants, the worst kind of Englishmen. In the spring of 1641, not long before the New England contingent arrived, the worst-case scenario became reality, and Spain captured the Puritan colony of Providence Island. Remember when we first met William Pierce, he was trading with the basically Puritan-supported pirates in the area that were plundering Spanish vessels. That's where those slaves had come from. So, from a Spanish standpoint, you took care of the piracy, right? You exacted revenge on Providence Island. Not only were the English probably seen as trespassers, but they'd also been in support of these pirate ships. So it was a double win for Spain and a huge loss for the English. So anyway, sometime before they arrived at Providence Island, the transplants were made aware of the situation. And as they approached the fort on July 13th, 1641, the ships had separated and Captain Pierce's ship was ahead of the ship carrying Humphrey, and it approached first. John Winthrop later recorded what happened that morning. He said, quote, "Mr. Pierce, a godly man and most excellent mariner, advised them to return and offered to bear part of the loss. But they, not hearkening to him, he replied, quote, 'Then I am a dead man,' end quote. And coming to the island, they marveled. They saw no colors upon the fort, nor any boat coming toward them, whereupon he was counseled to drop an anchor." Winthrop continued, "He liked the advice, but yet stood on into the harbor, and after a second advice, he still went on. But being come upon pistol shot of one fort and hailing, and no answer made, he put his bark a stays, and being upon the deck, which was also full of passengers, women and children, and hearing one cry out, 'They are traversing a piece at us,' He threw himself in at the door of the cuddy, and one Samuel Wakeman, a member of the Church of Hartford, who was sent with goods to buy cotton, cast himself down by him, and presently a great shot took them both. Mr. Pierce died within an hour. The other, having only his thighs tore, lived 10 days. End quote. Well, there you have it. The glorious and bloody end of Captain William Pierce and his man Samuel Wakeman. The whole thing seems so needless. Pierce made out better. I mean, he died quickly. Poor Wakeman suffered 10 days with, as Winthrop said, torn thighs. That had to be ugly. Anyway, Pierce had offered to turn around because of the danger and even cover some of the cost. The passengers would not let him do that. They would not let him. What was that conversation like? I mean, isn't the captain as good as a monarch on the open seas? I mean, still to this day, they're the law at sea, right? I can't imagine that was a soft-spoken meeting of the minds. I can just imagine some of these colonizers, getting right in his face. Now, you listen here, Captain Pierce. We didn't come all this way to turn around. You'll complete your mission. You'll take us all the way. The Lord didn't have us sail all this way to turn around. You received your pay. Now get back to it. Maybe that's about how it went. I don't know. I mean, they could have found another island, even another working colony in the area to land at. Did he really believe that continuing on would be his death? If you were him and you believed that, would you have continued? I mean, what kind of threats could have been made? What kind of mental gymnastics were played to reason that out? They were in Spanish territory, and the Spanish weren't very appreciative of the English encroachment, let alone all the piracy they had endured for decades. I mean, Elizabeth had turned a blind eye, and it had continued with every monarch since. And remember, Spain was a dominant colonizer. They were brutal to deal with. And what did the attack, quick as it seemed to be, feel like? I mean, I picture this eerie, silent scene on calm waters with a bright blue sky, like one of those promotional posters at a travel agency. Do they still have travel agencies? I'm not sure since the advent of the internet. I don't travel enough to know that. Anyways, and I can picture a fort with no flag showing. Maybe there's no people milling around, no smaller vessels coming out to meet them as they approached. Maybe no sound but the waves splashing on the side of the Desire, who had gone ahead again of the other ship and was approaching alone. I mean, maybe that made them look all the more vulnerable. Anyway, it's like they were coming upon an abandoned city. All the buildings and expected signs of civilization, but no people. It's kind of like a Twilight Zone episode or one of those Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, where he's all alone in some isolated border town or mining community. He and a lot of vulnerable town folk, and there they sit just waiting for an attack that they all know is imminent. I mean, if you picture the scene the way it could have naturally played out, it's spooky. And maybe the people got cold feet in those final minutes as they approached. I mean, that's reasonable to assume. Winthrop's record tells us that at least some of the people started telling Captain Pierce to stop short, to drop anchor at a little safer distance. Maybe to get a better look around, to look for signs of friendship or danger. And him, the able captain, after reluctantly continuing along the journey, was now stubbornly sailing them all into the very peculiar situation, if not downright deadly. There were women and children right there on deck. How tense was that scene? Was there pleading with him? Were the children crying? Were their mothers holding them close? Were they telling their husbands to do something? Was there yelling? I mean, did the colonizers yell at him to stop? Did he yell back? Did they all yell at the same time? I don't know. Maybe they stood and sailed in silence. But when I read these accounts sometimes that are like a few lines, almost sterilized, and then I mold the information over in my head and I begin to play the words that were used to describe the event as if they were a movie, it just becomes so much bigger. I could be way off, but the tension must have been high. I mean, the stakes were high. And I think of myself in that situation. How would I have reacted? I'll be honest with you. I would have been one of the people demanding that he continue on. I also may have gotten cold feet as we approached a fort with no people and no flags. At any rate, after taking on gunfire, the Desire, Pierce's ship, was able to turn around and along with Humphrey's ship, return to Boston. And what was that return trip like? I mean, did they stop along the way for supplies? And what would they have told those people? I mean, had they planned on human cargo going back? Was the plan to buy trade goods? I mean, that was the plan for Samuel Wakeman from Hartford, right? He was going to buy cotton for the folks in Connecticut. There must have been a plan when they were going back. They wouldn't have made a trip If there was going to be an empty ship going back, that'd be way too expensive, a complete waste of time. New England didn't have enough ships as it is, remember? They only could muster 2 ships for this journey. They could have brought more people. But then the attack happened. What did they talk about? Was there finger pointing? Did they complain about what they had given up in Boston, only to have to return to nothing? I mean, strangers living in their houses, jobs, or businesses lost to other people. I mean, no doubt there'd be work. They had a shortage of workers. But what kind of work would they find? Their entire lives were disrupted. I mean, did they give thanks to God for sparing their lives? I mean, this could have been an unmitigated disaster. Maybe we'd be talking about them the same way we still talk about Roanoke. Anyway, after this tragedy, word would spread and the mood for the greener pastures of the Caribbean would sour in Boston and greater New England, not just because of the potential danger, but by now Boston's economy was beginning to take off. Even the natives were mostly subdued at this point. Well, for a while. I mean, there was going to be that pesky uprising in about 30 years known as King Philip's War, with Philip Metacom and his confederation. But all in all, life was getting better, more settled, more organized. There were more opportunities, there was more prosperity, and they were safe in Boston. I mean, the Dutch were not much of an issue anymore, not a lot of danger, and the French were largely preoccupied with their own internal conflicts to the north. Saybrook would fail soon enough. Providence Island was gone. But the Earl of Warwick, one of the guys behind all these Puritan colonies, was not too quick to let go of his dream. And in 1643, he tried one more time to recruit Bostonians for another colony. This time, the destination was Trinidad. Captain John Chaddock had no takers when he tried to persuade New Englanders. The Boston magistrates had avoided a mass exodus. It could have been disastrous for them. Actually, at this time, the following year, the great experiment in Puritan education paid dividends. I mean, remember, they had focused on a world-class educational system as a way of attracting the best possible settlers. Well, New England would eventually send their college grads all over the world. We talked about that in our education episode. All over the world within the British Empire. But in 1642, historian Mark Peterson records that a group of Puritans from Virginia looked to Boston for ministers and leadership. They were a minority population down there, and instead of reaching out to the Caribbean or to England, they looked to New England. And that's just one more example of how Boston was really gaining traction and prominence. Real triangular trade was about to take off, and there were a few triangles. The big stories were the rise of the large-scale plantations on Barbados and the transplant of that unique, already identifiable emerging society or sub-society to the mainland, the region of the southern colonies, and the impact those transplanted Barbadians had for centuries. But those are stories for next time, and until then, I hope our time together this time has really made the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.